Wyoming Territory, July 1881. The wind kicked up dust across the dry hills as Florence Eaves stumbled over a rock and fell hard to her knees, the hem of her pale green dress torn and soaked in sweat. Her heart pounded like a runaway horse in her chest. Behind her, the distant sound of hooves still echoed somewhere off in the canyon. She had been running for hours. Her boots had blisters in them. Her ribs ached, but she could not stop. Not when her father meant to marry her off to a man nearly twice her age, a banker with a mean mouth and hands that had already grabbed at her once. She wiped her brow with a trembling hand, eyes scanning the horizon. A barn stood alone in a small valley below, part of a ranch pressed against the foothills. No house in sight, just that weathered red structure leaning into the wind like it had seen too many winters. She took off running again, lungs burning, braids slapping against her back. When she reached the barn, she squeezed through a warped side door. The air inside was warm and smelled of hay and horses. She collapsed behind a stack of feed sacks, chest rising and falling, clutching the small bag she had stolen from under her bed, just a few coins, her mother's locket, and a change of clothes. She did not mean to fall asleep, but when she woke it was dark and she was no longer alone. "Thought I heard something," a deep voice said from the shadows. Florence bolted upright, heart in her throat. A man stood in the barn aisle, lantern in hand, the flickering light catching the edge of his jaw and the dark hair curling at his collar. He wore a worn shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his eyes, clear, steady, rested on her, not unkind but cautious. "I am not here to steal," she said fast, her voice hoarse. "Please, do not send me back." He stepped closer, slow, like approaching a spooked foal. "Send you back where?" Florence clutched the bag to her chest. "Cheyenne. My father wants to marry me off, and I would rather die than let that happen." The cowboy set the lantern on a wooden beam and crouched. He did not ask questions right away. He looked at her like he was trying to figure a puzzle piece that did not quite fit. "I am Malcolm Mercer," he said after a pause. "This is my land." "I am sorry," she said. "I had nowhere else." He nodded once. "You hungry?" She blinked. "Yes." He stood, walked out, and returned minutes later with half a loaf of cornbread and a tin of beans. She ate sitting on a hay bale, him leaning against the stall door, arms crossed loosely. He did not ask more, just watched her like he was waiting for her to feel safe enough to talk. She liked that he did not press. When she finished, he handed her a blanket. "You can sleep here tonight." "I will not ask questions you are not ready to answer." "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. His gaze was calm. "Because you look like you have not had much kindness lately." She stared at him as he turned to leave. "Thank you." He paused. "Get some rest. I will be around come morning." She lay back on the hay, blanket pulled up tight. Her body ached, but her heart had slowed. For the first time in days, she felt like she might be safe. The next morning, Florence woke to the smell of coffee and fresh air blowing through the barn. Malcolm leaned against the doorframe, holding a tin cup in each hand. He offered one to her without a word, and she took it. They sat outside on the barn's front step, the sky streaked with the pink light of sunrise. Florence glanced sideways at him. He was a quiet man, maybe 30, maybe a little younger. Strong hands, sun-brown skin, steady voice. She felt something in her chest shift, just a little. "I was supposed to marry him in 2 days," she said quietly. "My father signed papers. It was not about love. It was business." Malcolm nodded. "That happens more often than it should. He was cruel. He said he would break me in like a horse if I gave him trouble." Malcolm's jaw hardened, but he said nothing, just looked out at the hills. "Do you think I was wrong to run?" she whispered. "No," he said. "I think you did what you had to do." She stared into her coffee. "I do not know what to do now." "You could stay here a while," he said. "Help out around the ranch. It is just me, and I could use an extra set of hands." Florence looked up, surprised. "You would let me stay? I do not make a habit of turning folks away who need help." She felt a sting behind her eyes. "I can cook. So, I know my way around a garden." He smiled a little. "Then we will get along fine." In the days that followed, Florence settled into a quiet rhythm at the ranch. She fed the chickens, helped weed the small vegetable patch, and learned how to lead the old mule. Malcolm showed her how to check the fence lines and mend a torn saddle strap. He was patient, always calm, and never looked at her in a way that made her stomach twist. One evening they sat on the porch steps after supper, the sky deep blue overhead. Lightning bugs blinked in the grass. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" he asked, voice low. "Sometimes," she said. "But I do not know where I would go." "I did," he said. "Before my brother died. We ran this ranch together. After he passed, it felt wrong to leave it behind." She looked at him. "You stayed because of love." He nodded. "Seems to me love is one of the few good reasons to stay or go." Florence's throat tightened. "I have never had someone love me without using it to control me." Malcolm turned to her. "Then maybe it is time someone did." The air between them shifted. She looked at his mouth, then back at his eyes. He did not move toward her, just waited. Her fingers brushed his, and he curled his hand around hers slowly, like he was afraid she might pull away. She did not. That night, she lay awake in the small room he had cleared out for her in the loft. Her heart beat fast, but not with fear this time. With something softer. Hope. She did not know what would come next, but she knew she wanted to find out with him. She had fled a forced marriage and hidden in a stranger's barn. But what she had found was something she had never expected. A cowboy with gentle hands. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to be free. By the second week, Florence had taken to checking the sky each morning before the chickens stirred. Malcolm noticed. She glanced west first, where the mountains paled in the early light, then south, lips pressed together like she expected something to come riding in under the clouds. "You looking for someone?" he asked one morning, his voice low over the sound of the pump handle creaking as he filled the trough. "No," she said, brushing her damp palms down the front of her skirt. "I just don't trust silence when it lasts too long." Malcolm didn't press. He handed her the tin dipper and went back to pulling nails from a busted yoke. She drank, quietly, then knelt to pull weeds from around the water trough, her hands working fast, like her body couldn't keep still unless her mind was at ease. That evening, she lingered in the kitchen after supper, drying the tin plates while Malcolm poured hot water into the basin. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wild mint from the bundle she'd tucked near the window. "You said you ran," he said, not looking up, but didn't say how far. "About 18 miles, she said. "Mostly on foot. Caught a ride with a trapper partway, but I didn't tell him where I was headed." "You think your father's still looking?" "I know he is." Malcolm nodded, drying his hands on a flour sack towel. "There's an old line cabin up near the ridge. Half a day's ride. No one uses it but me, and only when weather turns bad." "You want me to go?" she asked, straightening the plate in her hand forgotten. "No," he said, "but I want you to have somewhere else if you need it." Florence looked at him across the small table. "Why are you giving me places to run to?" "Because I don't want you to feel cornered," he said. "No one heals when they're backed against a wall." She set the plate down, slow and careful. "You always talk like that?" "Only when I mean something." Florence looked down at her hands, then up at him. "I don't know how to stop being afraid." "You don't have to," Malcolm said. "You just have to stop letting it decide everything." The lantern flickered between them, casting soft shadows over the table. Outside, a horse snorted and some night bird called across the dry hills. Florence reached for her shawl. "I want to see the stars." He followed her out to the porch where the sky stretched wide and full above them. She sat on the top step, pulling the wool tight around her shoulders. Malcolm leaned against the post nearby, arms folded. "I used to climb up on the roof back home," she said, "when I needed quiet. You'll find more of that out here than you know what to do with." She gave a dry laugh. "Maybe I need less noise inside, not outside." Malcolm glanced her way. "What was your mother like?" Florence's face shifted, the question catching her off guard. "She liked to hum when she cooked. Never songs I knew, just little pieces of melody, like she was keeping herself company." "She gone a long while?" 3 years. He didn't say sorry. Just nodded like he understood how long grief could hang around without needing to be named. "I used to think if I could just get through each day, I'd be all right," she said. But the days kept coming and I kept staying the same. You're not the same, Malcolm said quietly. She looked at him, the wind tugging her braid over one shoulder. How can you tell? Because you're standing here instead of where someone else wanted to keep you. They didn't speak for a while after that. The stars wheeled overhead and the wind softened to a whisper through the grass. When Florence stood to go inside, Malcolm reached out and brushed a bit of hay from her sleeve. His hand lingered a breath longer than needed. She didn't step away. Inside, she lit the small lamp by her bedside and sat down without removing her shoes. Her chest felt bruised in a way that wasn't pain but something close. She lay back, eyes wide open in the dark, and listened to the quiet creak of the house settling. In the distance, a coyote called. A lonesome sound, but not empty. The next day, Malcolm asked her to ride fence with him. She hesitated, eyeing the mare he saddled for her. She's steady, he said. Name's Clover. She won't throw you. Florence hadn't ridden since she was 12, but when she swung up into the saddle, something steadied inside her. They rode in silence for a while, the sun warm on their backs, the hills stretching out around them like folded cloth. Midway through the ride, they stopped to check a section of wire. He handed her the pliers without a word, and she squatted to twist a loose strand back into place. When she stood, her hands were smudged with rust, and her braid had come loose, strands catching in the wind. You learn fast, Malcolm said. I had to, she replied. He nodded but didn't smile. You don't owe me anything, Florence. I know, she said. But I want to stay anyway. That night, she baked cornbread without asking, and he poured her a cup of coffee without saying a word. They ate by the window, the lantern between them. When she reached for the butter, her hand brushed his. He didn't move away. Neither did she. Florence bent over the creek, rinsing the last of the suds from the tin basin. The afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwoods, dappling her arms with shifting light. A strand of hair stuck to her cheek, and she let the cold water wash it down her neck. Behind her, Clover grazed near the bank. Saddle loosened after the ride back from town. Malcolm had stayed behind to barter for seed corn and spare nails, giving her the afternoon to herself. She'd asked for it not because she needed solitude, but because the quiet between them had changed lately, and she needed space to understand what it was becoming. She wrung out the washcloth and hung it over a low branch. The creek burbled on, soft and steady. A twig snapped. She straightened slowly, not reaching for anything, just listening. A voice followed. Didn't expect to find you this far out. Florence turned. The man was older, lean as a fence post, with a red kerchief around his neck and dust in the creases of his trousers. His boots were worn down at the heels and a pistol hung heavy at his side. Her stomach dropped. Name's Royce Eaves, he said. Heard you'd run off. She didn't answer, just stood straight and still. He took a step forward, his eyes sharp beneath his hat brim. Your father's been raising Cain all over Cheyenne. Told the sheriff you were taken. I figured different. Florence kept her voice even. You've no right to follow me. You're wrong there. His tone turned oily. I put down a deposit. Your father owes me near 300. That makes you part of a contract. I am not property. He chuckled, low and mean. That's a fine thing to say when you're wearing a dead man's coat and squatting on land that ain't yours. She didn't flinch. You'll leave now. He took another step. You think that cowboy's gonna stop me? A shadow moved behind him. No, Malcolm said, voice like gravel under a boot. I will. Royce turned, hand twitching toward his belt. Malcolm didn't reach for his rifle. He just stepped into the clearing, slow and sure, his eyes locked on Royce's. There's no law says she has to go with you, Malcolm said. And if you touch her, there won't be time for a second mistake. Royce's lip curled. You think you got the right to tell me what's mine? I think you best get back on that horse before one of us does something we can't take back. The silence stretched. Then Royce spat in the grass. This ain't over. It is, Malcolm said. You just don't know it yet. Royce backed off, muttering, and swung up onto his gelding. The horse kicked up dust as they rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the trees. Florence hadn't moved. Malcolm turned to her. You all right? She nodded, but her hands trembled. He didn't touch her, just waited. I didn't know if he'd come himself, she said, her voice tight. But I knew someone would. You're safe here, he said. That won't change. She looked at him, then really looked at the man who'd stepped between her and a life she hadn't chosen, without drawing a weapon, without asking anything back. I believe you, she said. They walked back to the house in silence, side by side, not touching. But something had shifted. Not just trust, but belonging. She hadn't asked for it. He hadn't offered it outright. But it was there, in the space between their footsteps, in the way he opened the door and let her pass through first. That night, she sat at the table, needle in hand, mending the cuff of his second-best shirt. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her work. You always so like that? He asked. Like what? Like the thread might run out any second. She smiled faintly. I was taught not to waste anything, not even time. He stepped closer, slow. You don't have to rush here. She paused, needle poised. I don't know how not to. He reached down then, fingers brushing hers. Then I'll teach you. She let him take her hand. His touch was warm, calloused, steady. She didn't pull away. A late summer frost crept in early that year. By morning, the pumpkins behind the barn had gone silver at the edges, and Florence's breath showed in the air as she stepped out with the milk pail. Her fingers ached from the cold by the time she finished, but she didn't mind the sting. It made her feel solid, awake. Malcolm was already out in the pasture, hammering a post back into the earth where a mule deer had knocked it loose. She watched for a moment from the fence line, his back to her, coat collar turned up against the wind. There was a steadiness in the way he worked, not rushed, not slow, just certain. She had come to know each of his movements by now, how he always rolled his sleeves to the same place on his forearm, never higher, how he paused before speaking if something mattered. She made coffee before he came in. The cabin was warmer now, not from the stove alone, but from the way things had settled between them, like timbers fitted so tight the wind couldn't slip through. She poured him a cup without asking and set it beside his gloves on the table. Had a thought, he said once he'd warmed his hands around the tin mug. Old Will Tanner's moving to Fort Laramie to be near his daughter. He's selling off his goats and that cider press he built last fall. Florence glanced up from the cloth she was hemming. You thinking of buying it? I was thinking we could. She set the needle down. You mean us? Malcolm took a slow sip. You've been here near 2 months now. You keep this place running same as I do. If you want to call it home, I'd like that. Florence folded the cloth and rested her hands on it. I've never owned anything that couldn't be taken from me. That's no kind of life, he said. She stood and crossed to the stove, busying herself with nothing that needed doing. You're offering more than land. I'm offering a life, he said. But only if you want it. She turned, wiping her palms on her skirt. I do. The wind rattled softly against the shutters. He stood then, took the few steps across the room and reached for her hands. She let him. I've never been afraid of work, she said. I know. But I'm still learning what kind of man you are. I'll give you time, Malcolm said, voice low. As much as you need. She nodded, eyes steady on his. I won't ask what you want in return. I'd rather you did. What do you want? He didn't hesitate. You. Not for a season. Not until the next storm. I want to build something with you that lasts longer than either of us. A silence settled, but nothing in it was uncertain. She reached up, touched the collar of his coat, then rested her palm against his chest where his heartbeat thudded steady beneath her hand. I want that too, she said. The next morning, they rode to Will Tanner's together. The cider press stood beneath a tarp near the shed, and Florence ran her fingers along the wooden slats, already imagining the orchard they'd plant come spring. Will offered a price low enough to suggest he'd known why they'd come. On the ride back, Malcolm handed her the reins and let her lead. She didn't say much on the trail, but her posture was different, like someone who knew where she was going now, and why. That evening, they walked the property line together. The frost hadn't lifted all day and the grass crunched underfoot. Florence paused at the hilltop where the land sloped toward the cottonwoods. I thought I'd come farther to find something like this, she said. Sometimes the right place finds you first, Malcolm answered. She looked at him, her breath in the air between them. You were the first person who didn't try to take anything from me. I only ever wanted to give you back what was already yours. She stepped forward then, close enough that her forehead rested against the hollow of his neck. He wrapped his arms around her, not to hold her still, but to let her rest. The wind moved through the grass below them, slow and whispering. Neither of them spoke again before heading down the hill toward the house. But the silence had changed. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was full. The first snow came quiet, laying across the pasture like a wool blanket. Florence stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a mug, watching the flakes settle on the fence rails. The hearth behind her crackled low, its warmth steady against the cold seeping in through the floorboards. Malcolm was outside, feeding the livestock before the storm thickened. His coat was dusted white when he finally stepped inside, boots heavy with slush, eyes catching hers as he shut the door behind him. "You ought to rest," she said, setting the mug down. "It's not letting up." He hung his coat near the stove and peeled off the gloves before crossing the room. "Horses are settled. Coop's shut. Nothing left but sitting still." She smiled faintly. "You say that like it's easy. It is when you're not doing it alone." He reached for her hand, his fingers cold against her skin, and led her to the chair beside the hearth. They sat close, knees brushing beneath the wool blanket she pulled over them both. The fire cast a soft glow on the worn floorboards, and the wind outside grew louder, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Florence leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd find quiet I didn't have to earn through fear." "You've earned everything good that's come to you," Malcolm said. "But you shouldn't have had to." She traced the seam of his shirt sleeve with her finger, slow and thoughtful. "Do you ever think about your brother? What he'd make of all this?" He nodded once. "Every day. He'd have liked you. Would have said you've got grit and good sense, which is more than he ever said about me." Florence gave a soft laugh. "I think he'd be proud of you." Malcolm didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low and sure. "I've spent years working this land with no one to share it with. No one to tell when the first calf came, or ask if the beans were dry enough to can. I didn't know how much I missed that until you showed up." She sat up straighter, turning to face him. "I don't want to be someone who just passes through. I want to stay." "Then stay," he said. "Not because you're running. Because you're home." Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She'd done enough of that before she ever crossed onto his land. Instead, she reached into the side table drawer and pulled out the folded paper she'd been carrying since the day she left Cheyenne. "I never showed you this," she said, handing it to him. He unfolded the page slowly. It was a ledger, her father's signature across the bottom, and Royce Eaves' mark above it. "No legal hold," she said. "The marriage wasn't filed with the court. Just a private agreement between two men who saw me as something to trade." Malcolm folded the paper again. "This doesn't matter anymore. I know, but I wanted you to see it. I wanted to show you that I'm not bound to anything but what I choose." He stood and crossed the room to the hearth. She followed him with her eyes as he dropped the paper into the flames. It curled and blackened, the ink vanishing before their eyes. She crossed the room and took both his hands. "Then I choose you." The words settled between them with weight and warmth. He pulled her close, one arm at her waist, the other cradling the back of her head. Their kiss was slow, certain. No urgency. No uncertainty. Just the quiet knowing of two people who had weathered their share of storms and found each other whole on the other side. That winter passed with long evenings by the fire and mornings spent side by side tending the land. Florence learned to snowshoe out to the far pasture when the drifts were too deep for horses. Malcolm built a bread oven behind the cabin, and she filled the kitchen with the smell of rising dough and dried herbs. They planted garlic in early spring and watched the shoots push through the last of the frost. The cabin grew fuller with each passing month. Malcolm added a second room off the back with his own hands, and Florence stitched curtains from old flour sacks, her needlework tidy and even. One Sunday afternoon when the thaw had just begun, they walked the hill above the cottonwoods. The grass was still damp with melt, but wild violets had started blooming low to the ground. Malcolm stopped beneath the same cedar where they'd stood months before, watching the land unfurl in every direction. "I've been thinking," he said, reaching for her hand. "It's time to put your name on the deed." She blinked, startled. Malcolm, I don't want to just share this life with you. I want to make it yours as much as mine. Every fence post, every blossom, every morning we wake up in that house. Florence looked at the land below, then back at the man beside her. I never thought I'd belong anywhere. You don't just belong, he said. You built this with me. She nodded, voice steady. Then sign it together. That spring, when the lilacs bloomed and the creek ran full again, they stood beneath the cedar tree and said their vows. No preacher, no crowd, just the two of them, a shared promise, and hands clasped tight in the wind. Years later, folks passing through the southern edge of the Laramie Mountains would speak of the Eaves Mercer place, a quiet spread where the fences held firm, the garden never failed, and the house always smelled of bread and wood smoke. Where a woman with steady eyes and a man with quiet strength lived side by side, never needing to say much to be understood. And though the world changed beyond the ridges in that valley, love held fast and simple like the roots of the cottonwoods that had stood longer than memory. They grew old together there, not in silence, but in peace,